moment I see an effect like this, the first thought that comes to my mind is, can I recreate this effect? I start by eliminating the noise around the effect and try to deconstruct it to get a rough idea of what I am dealing with. Of course, not the full picture, but just enough to give me a solid starting point. Let's start with the body. No, not this body, the HTML body. Let's give it a background color black and set the margin to 0. Let's also set the display to flex to center our effect both vertically and horizontally. Now we need an SVG for the sparkle or star. I don't have much experience with SVGs, but I do know they can be quite intimidating, especially for beginners like me, despite having over 5 years of experience in full stack development. A JPEG or PNG image is made up of pixels, whereas an SVG uses mathematical formulas to define shapes and lines. When an image is scaled, it loses quality, but an SVG does not. To sum it up, SVGs allow for precise manipulation of elements within a defined space. You can create anything from simple lines to complex curves and even combine multiple paths and shapes to construct images. In our case, we can set up a star SVG and give it height, width and color. Now, let's define the viewbox dimensions so we can make it visible. The viewbox attribute allows us to control which part of the SVG drawing is visible. We will add a div and call it circle. We need to contain the circle and star. So we will group them inside another div and call it Gemini. I will tell my container to be slightly bigger than my star and tell my circle to be 100% of the container. Apply a gradient to the circle to make it visible. I won't go into the details of what a linear gradient is. Wait, you are supposed to be a circle, right? A border radius of 50% should fix the problem. Let's position the star absolutely on top of the circle. We center the star by setting top and left 50% and then translate by minus 50%. Now the fun part begins. When we hover over the circle, the star should rotate and change its color. Let's start with the first one. When we hover over the Gemini circle, the star needs to rotate 180 degrees. By setting a transition duration on the rotation, we can ensure that the rotation is smooth. Wait, why is the star returning to its original position even though we translated it to the center? The issue seems to be that when we hover over the circle, we are replacing translate with only rotate, which removes the translation part. We need to preserve the centering translation while applying the rotation, and vice versa. Finally, we will change the color of the star SVG on hover from white to black and set a transition time for the fill property. With that out of the way, we can move on to the gradient animation. By setting the gradient position to 800%, we can now animate the gradient from 0 to 200% by shifting the background position of the gradient. Let's give the animation some time to make it smooth. The next step is to add some rotation to our circle. Let's define the keyframes for the rotation by transforming from 0 degrees to 360 degrees and set the animation duration to 10 seconds. We are almost there, just one last animation before the final step. The circle is invisible by default and scales on hover. By setting the scale and opacity to 1 on hover and 0 by default, we can transition the circle smoothly when hovered. The final step is to add a morph animation where the circle transforms into multiple shapes. We can see there are 4 different shapes. First, the circle morphs into a wavy circle, then into a rectangle with rounded edges, and finally into a hexagon with rounded edges. Since we are familiar with SVGs, we can define keyframes for the morph animation and set the animation duration to 5 seconds. Wait, why are there 2 circles of different sizes? The circle SVG in the keyframes at 0% is smaller than the circle defined using border radius 50%. Let's switch this to an SVG as the rest of the shapes are SVGs as well. Set the animation play state to running on hover and to paused by default so that the animation resumes from where it was paused. All we did was break down the problem into smaller subproblems until we had something to start with, and then reverse engineered it to bring it as close as possible to the original Gemini animation by solving one problem at a time. Let me know in the comments how close we are to the original animation. Finally, check out the code pen link in the description.